So Councils for PR is a joint initiative between Make Votes Matter and Get PR Done. We worked out that we were both kind of doing similar work around councils and encouraging councils to get involved with the campaign for PR nationally. So we figured it was probably best to just join forces and work together rather than kind of divide our efforts and have a weaker result. I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir when I say that PR is desperately needed in the UK. I'm sure that's something that we all agree with. The current first past the post system means that vast numbers in this country are completely unrepresented. In the last general election in 2019, 71% of votes cast were essentially meaningless and had no effect on the outcome. First past the post also allows the government to wield a great deal of power with less than 50% of the vote share. In fact, in 2019, Boris Johnson achieved an 80-seat majority when he only increased his vote share by 1.2%, which is pretty shocking. Countries that use PR also take faster action on the climate change, on the climate emergency, which I know that's probably an issue that's very important to a lot of people here. They also go to war less, and they also more accurately reflect the societies that they represent. So on average, they have more diversity in their parliaments in terms of age, ethnicity, and gender. First past the post has actually been called the world's worst system for achieving gender equality. And you can find a lot more information about all that on Make Votes Matter's website and also Get PR Done's website as well. Now, given that we are here to talk about councils, some of you are probably wondering why we're not campaigning for PR at a local level. There have been some really good moves in this direction recently, particularly in Wales. I think I saw someone post in the chat about the work that Wales has been doing now. Councils in Wales can choose whether to run their elections on first past the post or a form of PR, which is great news. But we are still very much Westminster focused. Make Votes Matter and Get PR Done are both single issue campaigns for PR at Westminster, because we believe that if reform is achieved in Westminster, that's like the necessary first step, and then reform at other levels of government will necessarily follow from that. And hopefully the networks which we create here will be useful in generating this level of change as well. Now, we have over 20,000 councillors in the UK in over 400 councils, and I think for a lot of people, councillors play just as much of a crucial role, if not more of a role, in their day-to-day lives than their MPs do. So what councils say on this issue is really, really important, and we're going to talk later on about the role that they can play and also how we can all help in getting our councils to pass motions in favour of PR at Westminster. But I'm going to hand back now to Jeff, who will introduce our first speaker.
Okay, so I've just been checking to see if Clive has joined, Clive Lewis has joined yet. I can't see his name. So I'm going to introduce you to Amelia Womack. Amelia is the Deputy Leader of the Green Party for England and Wales. She was elected to that position at the age of 29. She works on raising awareness of local issues whilst campaigning at a national level, a theme we're going to be returning to later tonight. Amelia.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for being here. I keep feeling like a more powerful kind of politics should be just around the corner, a kind of politics that people can truly engage in because they know that it's about them and their future. I'm quite fed up with people talking about politics like it doesn't engage them, but to be honest, in many ways, it doesn't. Those places that feel like they have to vote for one party or another to get the least bad option, those people that can't vote for what they believe in because they believe it's a wasted vote and can't see that the only wasted vote is one that doesn't represent you. Councils that, as was mentioned, fail to return the kind of diversity that is reflected in their communities. No wonder people are frustrated by politics. No wonder they feel like they don't have a say. in places where a few marginal seats can decide the future of the country, and in places where even when you increase a vote share for a party, doesn't always mean you get more of that party elected. Things are broken. We need reform in so many areas, but people in their local communities should feel more connected to their councils. Local politics should be a powerful place. The reason I reflect on diversity quite often is when you look at what happens at any level of politics, is you tend to return the same politicians as the round before. It will be the same seats. It will often be the same people. I just want to read out a few statistics about the current diversity of councils across the country. 45% of councillors are retired. 53% are male. The average age, 59. 96% are white. 88% are straight. Only 16% have a long-term health problem or disability. When we have a more proportional system, we see across Europe, across the world, that we do get more diversity elected into those chambers, into those councils, into those parliaments, simply because we are shaking up a broken system, but also because it means that we are able to ensure that more diverse people do run, using things like zipping systems, where lots of countries will have gender, for example, being every other position. The top person on a list will be, it's always better if it's a woman, if you're really working for better diversity, followed by someone with a different gender all the way down to the end of your list. When we talk about diversity, it is important. When you travel the country and you see populations that simply don't have councillors elected from their communities, especially when you're talking about people of colour, people who are Muslim, and people who are part of the migrant community, and yet their lives are being chosen by people who simply don't have their experiences. I believe that age is a really important part of this as well. You only know what it's like to be 18, 20, 25 in 2022 if you're living it. And our community should be working for all generations. But if you're not experiencing those experiences, then you're not the person to make those best decisions. As the Green Party, I'm sure that you can understand why I'd be frustrated with people talking about wasted votes. We've been proving that we beat the first past the post voting system time and time again in elections. We've been proving that the only wasted vote is a vote that you don't believe in. But time after time, you see things like in Islington, for example, in 2018, when we elected one Green from what was an entirely Labour council back in, well, before 2014, but had previously been an entire Labour council, we returned, the Labour Party then returned just over 55% of the vote, but they won 98% of the seats. Now, getting one Green elected does actually make a real difference. I compare it quite often to a psychological experiment that happens. There's a room, inside that room, somebody's taken in, and there's that game. You might know the one where it's there's a metal machine, metal loop, you've got a metal wire, pole, and then you go around, and if the two bits of metals connect, it sets off a buzzing noise. The person goes into the room with a person in a white coat, and every time it buzzes, the person in the white coat marks down how many times they have hit that buzz. Suddenly a phone call happens and the person goes, "So sorry, I've got to leave the room. Could you mark your own work? Just every time it buzzes, mark it down." And the first time it happens, without the person in the lab coat out of the room, the buzz goes and the person being experimented on looks round. Doesn't mark it down. It buzzes again and they don't mark it down. Normally it does take the third time and they will mark their own work correctly, but only about 1 in 3 times that they make that buzz happen do they correctly put it forward. Now, this is an experiment, so as you probably guessed, there is another group of people. This time they go in, and as the small talk is happening into the room, the person in the lab coat says, "Oh, it's really interesting, this room. There's a chair in the corner, and it said there's a woman sat in it, looking out to the whole room, always looking around, always observing." So the same thing happens. The phone call goes, the person in the lab coat leaves. "Please may you mark your own work." The first buzz happens, and they look to the chair and they mark it correctly. Now, I'm not saying that when we get Green councillors elected that we haunt councils, but that kind of scrutiny is so vital and important. When we ask councillors and councils to mark their own work, they're not always going to do it correctly, quite simply because that scrutiny isn't there. Stronger councils are there with stronger diversity. That is diversity that means that when people vote, that they have their priorities recognised within the council. It's about making sure that parties who are voted for are represented, communities that have been voted for are represented, gender, sexuality, the list goes on. Because quite simply, politics is about us, about our communities, about the places we live. And when we're not represented, of course we get fatigued by politics. Of course people say that it doesn't represent them. Proportional representation is one of the most powerful ways to truly ensuring that we have that representation. And the most power should always be at the grassroots, at the local communities. When we're in Wales, for those councils that do vote to have a more proportional system, I'm really excited about what that can really return for those communities. But politics must work for everyone. I would say, I think I really liked Holly's point about it being the first past the post being the worst voting system. I can only think of one that's worse, that returns less diversity, and that would actually just be the Vatican. And obviously they release their results with smoke. So when we're looking at antiquated systems, we're really not setting the bar very high.
Amelia, thank you ever so much. I'd now like to introduce Max Wilkinson. He's a councillor in Cheltenham for the Liberal Democrats. He was re-elected this month with 63% of the vote in his ward. He's just been selected as the Lib Dem parliamentary candidate for Cheltenham, whose current MP was elected on less than 50% of the vote. Max.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you for inviting me along. I've dashed back from Cheltenham International Film Festival, where I've missed the start and in the entirety of The Good Boss this evening to be on this panel. I think the purpose of all this should be that we get better bosses in politics rather than the same old stuff, as Amelia neatly alluded to. But I'll try to focus on the general principles of PR rather than talk about local government or in particular. And quite often when we start talking about PR voting systems, we get told that we should stop talking about changing the voting system because it's one of those hobby horses for sore losers. And of course, as a Liberal Democrat, I know that losing can leave you feeling pretty sore. And anyone in Cheltenham will know that I lost by a very small number of votes at the last general election. And indeed, I wouldn't have joined the Liberal Democrats if the only thing that I was interested in was winning, in the same way that Amelia wouldn't have joined the Green Party if the only thing that she was interested in was winning. It's about principles. And Amelia neatly encapsulated some of those that we should all be working for, whatever political party we're in. And as a Liberal, my support for proportional representation is motivated primarily by belief in pluralist politics. I believe in a type of politics which encourages politicians to work together and doesn't just encourage them to, actually forces them to. And then we can find consensus and reflect the real diversity of views that we have in this country that Amelia has referenced there. But of course, we're not going to get that unless the voting system values every opinion equally, and it just doesn't at the moment. Until we do that, the injustice in this political system will continue. We will fail to engage the population in the political process. We will fail to reflect the many different viewpoints on offer. And it won't just fail to reflect those viewpoints, it will actively silence many viewpoints in the political system and in our communities. And ultimately, that means that we will fail to deliver policies that address the concerns of the public. And of course, that is most keenly felt at Westminster level, where we have first past the post as our voting system. And while I'm here today speaking as a councillor who is in favour of PR, I've also stood in 2 general elections, and I plan to fight the next one here in Cheltenham for the Lib Dems. In the first, I came third in Doina's neck of the wood in Stroud, and I came third with 3.2% of the vote, which tells you how polarised things were in that general election. And many people in Stroud told me that they would like to have voted for me, and maybe I would have even saved my deposit in those circumstances, but they knew that I couldn't win, so they didn't vote for me. The Green Party candidate came a little bit behind me in that election. And indeed, I'm sure that Sarah, the Green Party candidate, would have done better in that election in those circumstances as well if we had a different voting system. In the next general election I stood, which is 2019, a Labour candidate lost his deposit. And people didn't vote Labour because they knew that Labour couldn't win in Cheltenham. And this is the thing, that doesn't mean it's a wasted vote, but this is an inevitable consequence of a voting system that squeezes out every single opinion that is not in the top 2 in that area. And at a national level, it squeezes out all of the third party, fourth party, fifth party, and other minority party voices. And in that same election in 2019, another candidate gallantly stepped aside as part of a national deal. That arrangement failed, not just in my constituency, but in every single constituency. And it shouldn't have been necessary to do that. And it did again squeeze out minority voices from the political process. And in that election in 2019, the winning party at national level received under 44% of the vote, but won with a landslide majority. If that was a one-off, I'd accept the accusation that some people make, that those of us calling for change to the voting system are just a bunch of whingers. But sadly, that's not the case, because in every general election I can remember, and indeed there may be some people in the room who remember the last time that a winning party in a general election got more than 50%, but every general election I remember, the winning party won with less than 50% of the vote, and in many cases got a landslide. And that applies to Labour in 97 as much as it applies to the Tories in 2019. But I think it's interesting for us to reflect on the impact of first past the post on the Conservative Party recently too, because in 2019, the Conservative Party shifted dramatically to the right to soak up the nationalist vote, people who would have voted either for the Brexit Party or for UKIP. And would this rightward shift to gobble up that vote have happened? And would we now be governed by such a right-wing government in any other system other than first past the post? I think the answer is clear, absolutely not, because the risk of alienating the traditional moderate Conservative Party vote would have been far too great for the Tories to toy with that idea. And on that note, some in the room tonight will see PR as a means to an end, just the way we get rid of the Tories. I have, of course, a huge amount of sympathy with that opinion. However, for me, that isn't the primary goal of proportional representation. We need to find a way to make sure that all votes are equal, whether those are votes that we agree with or that we disagree with. And that needs to be a key principle of this campaign, particularly if we're going to sell it to those who aren't necessarily always in the paid up progressive politics clubs that some of us and most of us in this room will be in. So what's the role of councils in this? Well, Amelia has spoken about the potential for PR at local council level elections. I think this campaign needs to focus very much on what Holly was speaking about at the beginning, which was about changing the voting system at Westminster first, then everything else will cascade down because it will become the norm. As a Liberal, I believe in grassroots community action, and the most local level of democracy for most people will be their local council. That could be a parish council, it could be a town council, a district council, a county council, or a unitary authority. And by passing motions at our local councils, we can translate some of that local pressure on local politicians into national pressure. Councillors regularly talk to MPs, MPs regularly talk to their party leaders. And national pressure is so important. The recent strides towards PR in the Labour Party are incredibly important, and Clive's hopeful presence here later on this evening will be really welcome. And I know that the Labour Party is going to be key in getting through PR at the national level at some future point. But I desperately hope that whoever is in power after the next general election, the pressure will have become too much to bear, whoever is in power, whether that's Labour, Conservatives, or some other arrangement. And I'd like to thank in advance everyone who votes tactically in the next general election for candidates who will support proportional representation. That is an important principle as well for this campaign. So thank you very much for inviting me along this evening. It's a pleasure to be on the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Max. I'd now like to introduce Councillor Ricky Knight from Barnstaple in North Devon. He stood for election on 26 occasions, which probably tops most of the people on this call, I suspect. Not always successfully, but he almost became the first Green Party MEP in 2009. He's been a lot more successful as a councillor in Barnstaple for the last 18 years. And now as a member of the Committee of Councils for PR, he's guiding the motion through Barnstaple Council.
Hello, everybody. Again, as Alex has just said, and I'm sure Amelia, it's a pleasure to be on this panel talking to a pretty impressive participation of 192. I got that down here. I was expecting to follow on from Clive Lewis, but I'm very glad I had a chance to listen to Max, and of course to be reunited visually with you, Amelia, is a great pleasure, having last seen you in Glasgow. So yes, I was going to say to Clive, as a graduate of UEA, South, near Norwich South, I did actually wend my way all the way across England in 2010 to support Adrian Ramsey in his campaign. Adrian Ramsey, the co-leader of the Green Party at the present moment. It seemed like a good idea at the time, you know, because of my affiliation and a love of Norwich, as it were. The reason I mention this, and the fact of the 2015 landslide for Clive, was that in 2010 and in 2015, the combined vote of the Labour, Green and Liberal Democrat, inverted commas, alliance, was triple that of the Tories in both times. And isn't that just our problem, as Alex has obviously alluded to? It's just the fact that divided we fail, and united, I'm afraid the Tories have taken on that maxim, they win. And it breaks my heart, to be honest. Okay. To borrow a North Devon surfing analogy, because we are the surfing paradise, come on down, we've got to catch this wave. It's a breaking wave. Every time after a general election, we have a couple of weeks of, you know, soul searching and hand wrenching about PR, and it fades after a couple of weeks. But it seems to be different now. We're almost, well, ostensibly between elections, but the momentum seems to be increasing. That this is all gone wrong. It's not just because it is wrong, but because we are now. I'll say it clearly, we are now in the dark times of one of the most corrupted and incompetent governments in living memory. And if anything's going to concentrate the mind, it's got to be that reality that we are entering, as Valerie Black pointed out in her wonderful speech, we are entering an era of quasi-fascism. And I won't mince words. I've failed to use that word for years, but not any longer. I've been a Make Votes Matter supporter and more than a supporter ever since I first met Kleiner back at the Green Party conference, crikey, over a decade ago. And likewise, Get PR Done was when I first met Alan Storey at a Green Party conference. And it was Alan, in fact, who encouraged me to be a bit more proactive as a local councillor. In fact, more than that, Alan gave me the wording, which always helps. And we have the wording, after all, for this general election PR motion for councils for PR. So a little bit about Barnstaple and North Devon. I think it's, Alex might have alluded to this fact. The Southwest seems to be a little bit different than the rest of the country, but certainly Northern Devon and Cornwall to a lesser extent is, North Devon is a Thorpe country, Jeremy Thorpe country, regardless of his unillustrious past, but nonetheless, in many respects, the Liberal Democrats in Northern Devon and Torridge side have taken on the hue of the National Labour Party, insofar as I feel, or I fear even, that they might think that they can do it by themselves, you know? First past the post serves them well. It's not so much a blue-red pendulum as a green, as a blue-yellow pendulum. So I had this earlier motion, well worded, about getting PR for local elections. So I submitted it to my local council, quite short, quite succinct, quite coherent. It's got to be short to fit into the agenda. And submitted to the press, invited the press to come along to the full council meeting, which they did. Now, my large town council is a Liberal Democrat fiefdom. I don't say that negatively, it is. They've been Liberal Democratic majority for, well, throughout my life, actually, which is extensive. At the moment, there are 22 Liberal Democrats and 2 Greens. So it's a different dynamic. So in submitting the motion for getting PR done for local elections was a bit of a no-brainer. It was simple. It was unanimously supported. But I had, but the follow-up was very important, and I'll come back to that in a second if I got time. Namely, that the reporter who came to the meeting more or less reported the motion and my passionate speech in favour of my motion verbatim, and it was quite a long article, and it got submitted to the rest of North Devon, who bought the journal anyway. Again, I'll come back to that. It's a win-win. In other words, I would maintain that even if you're confronted, so I'm talking to the councillors on this Zoom, which is the reason why we're here after all. Even if you're confronted by a right of centre cohort or a full house of Labour, non-progressive Labour councillors, it doesn't really matter if this motion, not just the one I submitted, but the one I will be submitting, and hopefully as many of you, your councillors as possible, we will be submitting to your councils about getting PR for general elections. Regardless of the result of any motion being defeated or supported, it's still a very resonant and coherent and effective press release, and it will be picked up. I'm pretty certain of that. That's why I say it's a win-win. One of the, and I actually stop now because I know I'm still hoping that Clive's going to join us, and he's missed my eulogy of praise earlier on because he's been an absolute maverick when it comes to supporting a PR. Good for him, because Alex said as much, and we all know it. The crucial ingredient of everything we're fighting for is the Labour Party getting into power. When people say, well, what's the point? What are you going to do with this motion? You're going to submit it to the press? You're going to send it somewhere else to the government, to Westminster? Are they listening? I always hark back to what happened in Bristol. When Carla Denyer submitted her climate emergency motion, at the time, it was one of the first. But then it got adopted more and more by our local councils, my unitary council, the Devon County Council, throughout England and in many, many countries of the world. And of course, it got to Westminster, and even Westminster passed it. This is what can happen. If we get a groundswell, momentum, movement forward, I think the more councillors or more councils that support this, then I believe that we can have a similar sort of momentum going forward for getting PR in through local councils. So I hope this is the result of tonight's wonderful combination of Make Votes Matter and Get PR Done and all the other organisations involved with electoral reform. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Ricky, and good luck with the motion down in Barnstaple. Yeah. I'd like to introduce you to William Relton. William is again one of the 13 members that have been supporting the development of councils for PR at the moment. We actually want more than 20 people, so we need a few volunteers if people can put their hand up towards the end of this. William, we used to have 2 motions. We now have 1 motion as a model motion. Would you like to explain it to people?
Yes, I've got a copy of it in front of me. Thanks, Jeff, and hello, everybody. Very good to meet everybody. And here is the motion. Councils for PR, model motion, May 2022. Council notes, first past the post, FPTP, originated when land-owning aristocrats dominated Parliament and voting was restricted to property-owning men. In Europe, only the UK and authoritarian Belarus still use archaic single-round FPTP for general elections. Meanwhile, internationally, proportional representation, PR, is used to elect parliaments in more than 80 countries. Those countries tend to be more equal, freer, and greener. PR ensures all votes count, have equal value, and those seats won match votes cast. Under PR, MPs and parliaments better reflect the age, gender, and protected characteristics of local communities and the nation. MPs better reflecting their communities leads to improved decision-making, wider participation, and increased levels of ownership of decisions taken. PR would also end minority rule. In 2019, 43.6% of the vote produced a government with 56.2% of the seats and 100% of the power. PR also prevents wrong winner elections, such as occurred in 1951 and February 1974. PR is already used to elect the parliaments and assemblies of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, so why not Westminster? Council therefore resolves to write to HM government calling for a change in our outdated electoral laws to enable proportional representation to be used for general elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. I was just looking at some of the chat before I go to Doina, on the assumption that Doina is going to be our Labour representative this evening. One of the things that people are sort of talking about is you've got, if you live in an area with a Conservative dominating council that are not pro PR, one of the things that we've discussed doing is that is isolating those councils, the councils that don't pass PR motions, given that we're going to push dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of councils to push these motions through. The ones that don't represent us are the ones we want to expose in the media. So one of the key parts of our whole campaign is that we're going to use this as a big public relations exercise. We're going to communicate with a lot of people, whether it's letters to papers or whether it's in the BBC local radio stations or regional media. And I know a number of the people, the councillors and others, will be more than happy to go and talk about why they've passed the motion in their particular council in the media and how appalling it is that other people are not being represented by their councils. So just bear that in mind. But first of all, we go after the councils we know where we can get this motion passed. Doina Cornell. Doina Cornell is the leader of Stroud District Council. She's just been, I think, re-elected, Doina, if I've got that right. She's leading a Rainbow Alliance that's been in place there, I think, for over 10 years now. And it's a Rainbow coalition of the Lib Dems, the Greens and Labour. Over to you, Doina.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I've been on tenterhooks whether I'm going to be speaking or not. So it's a bit of a theme of my day. I was involved in an event this morning, actually, around opening a bridge over our canal, and I only found out at the last minute I had to introduce the Lord Lieutenant or the Deputy Lieutenant of Gloucestershire. So I seem to be winging it a bit today, and I'm very glad to see I've got some other councillors, I think, from the Green Party from my district on the call as well. So is something I've thought about a lot, so I have put some notes together. So obviously I only had a little bit of notice to do it. As you mentioned, we've been running an alliance. We don't call ourselves a coalition, we're not very keen on that word, a cooperative alliance for over 10 years now. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary in May, and I suspect we're probably one of the longest running arrangements of its sort. When the Conservatives lost the majority in 2012, and there was the prospect of the council went into no overall control, and there was a discussion around whether Labour would go into an alliance with any of the other parties. At that time, that was very, very rare for councils to do that. We had to get special permission from the Labour NEC. But I think it's become more and more common over the increasing years. We do have no overall control councils, and we've got lots of examples, some new ones that have just come out in the last May elections. So I think sort of the background to this evening's discussion is actually councillors have got really good lived experience about how to work in a practical way with other parties. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because one of the criticisms we get, particularly within the Labour Party, that going to a form of proportional representation means you have to form coalitions or other arrangements with other parties, and it's always seen by default as a weakness. And I think we can demonstrate within Stroud district actually that can be a very positive thing. And the way the whole politics is based within our district is around compromise and consensus and building a common platform of shared policies, which at local level often you've got very, very strong shared objectives that you want to achieve. And the other point I wanted to make as a Stroud, as a district, one of the reasons why we're in that arrangement is we are politically very diverse. We have strong representation across all of the four main parties, Labour, Lib Dems, Greens and Conservative. So although we don't have electoral reform, we do actually have an administration that's quite representative of the community it serves. And I think that that's a strength of the council. There's a lot of work that has to go into an alliance like that. Building consensus takes a lot of time. And I think as leaders of the administration, that's something we need to put a lot of effort into it. But I think what's good to see, as I said, this is a criticism that comes up quite frequently, has done in the past from Labour members. But there's absolutely no question there's an increasing number of Labour members of the party who are in favour of electoral reform. You saw actually how strong the showing was at the conference last year, and that's growing. And I think particularly within the Southwest, we've seen which is the area I'm most familiar with, we've certainly seen a more powerful movement. If we look at party by party, local party by local party, our party is affiliated to the Labour campaign for electoral reform, and we're certainly seeing that growing in other areas as well. And also, I think someone put in the chat about Unison, we're seeing a growing support across the trade union movement as well, which isn't, not everyone in the trade union movement is a Labour Party member, but they collectively represent millions of people across this country. So if we get more and more unions to support as well, they're a really powerful advocate and a voice for electoral reform. So I really look forward to us seeing that growing as well in the next year or so. But of course, as you've mentioned, the Labour Party is absolutely crucial for us to get this over the line. We need to see this in the next Labour manifesto because it's going to be impossible to do it without having that party's support. And I know that hopefully Clive might be able to join us. Obviously, he's a very powerful voice for that, but I think you'll see that there's a growing number of leading Labour voices. Luke Pollard, who also represents the Southwest, is again a strong voice in favour of electoral reform. So I think what we can do as a council is we are influential within our local communities. I think, as I've explained, we're a model within our community as how we can work with many parties working together for the benefit of local residents. And that's well represented, for example, in the high levels of satisfaction we have as a council. We're well regarded. So I think we can play that role. We can be influential. And I'm looking to sort of see that I've just had a look at, I looked at the text of the motion while you were speaking. It's a good short motion. It's nice, short and sweet. So I think that's something we can absolutely look forward to bringing forward ourselves as a council to adopt it. We have actually brought forward motions, not exactly on that line, but certainly similar ones in the past around votes at 16 and other motions in support, for example, of having electoral reform at the local government level as well. And I do want to just mention the fact that, of course, Westminster is the most crucial element of it, but local government is absolutely crucial as well. I think Amanda mentioned about local government is so poorly represented. It's so unrepresentative. In many ways, it's almost worse, I think, than what you've got in Westminster now, which at least has around, well, certainly, it's increasing representation of women, for instance, but it's really woeful at the local government level. And so I think the quality that we'd like to see at the local government level with electoral reform would certainly increase that diversity. And so what we would see is that local government really does reflect the communities that it represents, and that would make for better decisions. Because at the end of the day, for me, that's what this is all about, is the quality of the politics, the decisions which are made. And I think we've demonstrated that in Stroud, building on that consensus, finding that common ground, showing that parties can work together is a really powerful model. And I think someone made the point, we're preaching to the converted in this meeting. What we need to do is take that message out and convince people this is something really, really important that they need to support. Just to give you one practical example of how beneficial and how positive it can be, I want you to contrast how we ran our local government through the pandemic and what happened at the national level. When the pandemic hit, and then as a local council, we had a complete suspension of any decision-making powers. We couldn't meet in person. We had to make lots and lots of decisions very, very quickly in an emergency. And I took the view as a leader that it would be most beneficial for our community is if all the parties were involved in those decisions, as well as our alliance partners, also to bring the Conservatives in as well. We wanted messages to get out to our community which would reach all parts of the community. As a Labour leader, I didn't necessarily want to be saying something which might not hit the ground and be receptive in an area that potentially was quite conservative. So all the 4 leaders came together. We in the early stages of the pandemic, we talked with our senior officers. We made collective decisions when we hadn't got that formal decision-making process in place. And as a result, I think we had very good messaging across the district. We had really good community support. It really felt the whole community was drawing together. And let's contrast what you had at the national level, where there was an exclusive way of doing politics. None of the other parties were included in the decision making. And I think we saw what were the results, a calamitous result, I think, for our country. So I think, and I'm also reminded of the fact during the Second World War, we had a Conservative Prime Minister, but we had a Labour Deputy Prime Minister. So it's not just about sort of you know, getting that reform, it's about increasing the quality of the politics and having better decisions, which at the end of the day will be better for the people we represent. So that really is what is at stake. And just to finish up with that, obviously I'm really happy to support this campaign. I'm really pleased all the people who've come on board with it, and I look forward to it growing in support. I think someone touched on it, Ricky touched on it, around how crucial it is. The next general election is going to be possibly the most important one that we face for the fate of this country. Look at what the government is currently doing. The legislation which has just been passed through, we've all been so busy worrying about Partygate. Are we actually paying attention to the fact we've now got voter ID, the concern around the suppression we will see of voters going into the next general election? So there's some really serious threats that our democracy faces next time round. So this is so important. This is so important that we get this across the line this time. So I really hope that we're going to bring the Labour Party with you. Watch what happens at Liverpool with interest in September. We'll certainly do our level best to make sure we get it there. I think the movement is definitely growing. Hopefully the momentum is there to get the Labour Party to adopt this. It's absolutely essential that we do. Anyway, very happy to do our bit in Stroud. I think we've got Catherine, who's the deputy leader, who's green, on the call with us. So you see we've got good power sharing there. So we'll certainly be having this conversation after this meeting about how we can get that motion adopted. And thank you very much. Hopefully I've done an all right job. I did actually meet Clive last week. We had a good chat. I didn't know at that point I might have to substitute for him, but I hope to be sharing a platform with him in the months to come. But thank you very much, Jeff, for asking me to substitute at the last minute.
Thank you, Doina, for standing in. I think one of the points that Doina's raised there very much is that there are multiple fronts on which the campaign for PR is running, whether it's within the trade unions, within the Labour Party, across and here across councils. And I think it's the groundswell of change that's coming into the country now, of which it's tremendous to have nearly 200 people on this call now. Now I want to pass over to Alan's story. Alan is up in Sheffield, and again he's coming from Get PR Done. He's one of the founder members on the committee for Councils for PR. And Alan, I think you're going to talk to us a little bit about the call to arms, about what can individuals do, either as councillors or as campaigners, to drive this forward. Alan.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, Alan Story here from Sheffield. Wasn't born in Sheffield, but that's okay. Yes, we started this committee about 6 weeks ago, Make Votes Matter and Get PR Done. We've been working together. We've now got a core group of 13 people. But we just got yesterday the names of 270 councillors who are sympathetic to PR. How can 13 people contact 270? That's a very difficult job. We need more people in the committee. So if you could just take out your pen and paper and write down this email address: contacts@councilsforpr.org.uk. contacts@councilsforpr.org.uk. That email is a person by William, and he will get your email tomorrow, and I will send out the message, among others, that he can send to you, which is the fact that on Wednesday night, we're going to have a follow-up. We don't expect to have 180 people there. 10 would be great, but do want people who want to get active in the campaign. what we're doing, we've got this model. It's sort of like the door-to-door salesman model or the repping model, where what we have this list of now, I think they're approaching 300 councillors who are sympathetic on some level to PR. And every member of our core group, and we hope to get about 10 more, is going to be given the names of 5 councillors. Go out and contact that councillor. We want independent, active people. We'll give you the instructions and then go for it. And we're going to talk about how to do that at our meeting on Wednesday night. We've already got Zoom calls set up, 7 o'clock Wednesday night. Maybe 10 of you, the 10 would be great. That would almost double the size of the committee. We'd sit down and have a chat, in much more sort of restrained circumstances about the practicality of how you can become what we call a caseworker going to get a priority councillor. The priority councillors then we'd ask them to take our motion to their own council. William, for example, wrote last week to York Council, a fairly major city up in the north. They're on board. They said, this is a no-brainer. The Lib Dems and Greens control that council. Go for it. They said they'll go. We want this to be springing up like little mushrooms all over the country. We want Keir Starmer to wake up reading his newspaper. Oh God, the council in York is supporting PR. It's somewhat like the model used by the Green Party in declaring a climate emergency. We want councils across this country to say, we have a stake in the kind of democracy we have. So we're going to pass this, pretty short motion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. And as has been pointed out there, it is contact@councilsforpr.org.uk, and that's for FOR as well. We will respond to the questions. We'll probably take all the comments we've had, and we're going to try and build them into what we put on the website. So you will see some of the responses back. I've got Ricky Knight has got his hand up, so I'm just going to take Ricky Knight's comment.
Thanks, Jeff. Just quickly answering Lee Cowan's question, which is so apposite. How do we get the general public on board with this? I think they already are, just a question of finding out. It's just, I'd like to mention, I'm a member of Compass, as are many of people on this call. And our local Compass Northern Devon group is having a series of street stalls in 8 different towns in Northern Devon. And we're meeting on Saturday mornings for 3 hours, just talking to the public with our opinionometer. Can I say that right? The Brexitometer rebirthed as an opinionometer, and getting to stick things on. I think that's a great way of maintaining energy on this issue and also engaging the public. And it's not a waste of time. So Lee Cowan and anyone else, get out there on the street and try that one. Thank you.